In 1991, the original crew of the USS Enterprise signed off, literally, with Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, earning critical acclaim and the biggest box office for the franchise since The Wrath of Khan. With Star Trek: The Next Generation ending its successful 7-season run on TV, the time was right to give the Next Generation crew the reins to the big screen franchise. But all involved were wary of making what would be seen as just an extended episode. Thus, the bold move was made to work in none other than Captain James T. Kirk, who would meet his maker in the movie's climax, passing the torch to Patrick Stewart's Jean-Luc Picard. That's right, it's time to tackle Star Trek Generations.
So unnecessary.
To shepherd the Next Generation's move to the big screen, Paramount Pictures decided just to give the reins of the feature film over to the Next Generation producer Rick Berman, who would enlist two of his best writers, Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga, to develop the screenplay. Director David Carson, who helmed one of the Next Generation's best episodes, Yesterday's Enterprise, was hired to direct. One had to give the studio credit for allowing the TV gang to craft their own movie, and none of them had much in the way of feature experience. However, many of the Next Generation episodes were considered near feature quality, and the budget, as a concession to the fact that putting the new crew on the big screen would be kind of a risky move, ended up being pretty small, only $25 million, which was a fraction of what most big movies cost at the time.
What's normal? What's normal? That's a good question.
To help make the Next Generation gang seem feature-worthy, an ace movie cinematographer, John A. Alonzo, who had shot Chinatown and Scarface, was hired, and the sets and models used to showcase the Enterprise D would be totally overhauled. ILM would sign on to do the effects, some of which would include CGI. There had also been a plan to overhaul the uniforms in order to give them a bit of a big screen oomph, but in the end this was abandoned, although some of the uniforms from Deep Space Nine were used as they looked better on the big screen. Apparently, Jonathan Frakes and LeVar Burton actually borrowed theirs from Avery Brooks and Colm Meaney, who were roughly the same build. So how did William Shatner end up in the movie?
Excuse me, there will be plenty of time for questions later.
Originally, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy were all supposed to be in it. In the final film, you notice that Kirk is joined by James Doohan's Scotty and Walter Koenig's Chekhov on the maiden voyage of the Enterprise B, where Kirk presumably has his fatal accident. It was supposed to be Spock and McCoy, with Leonard Nimoy turning down the role because it was too minor, while DeForest Kelley, who was in declining health, simply couldn't get insured. In fact, if you watch the movie, it's painfully obvious that all of his dialogue was supposed to go to McCoy, with Chekhov for some reason taking over sickbay despite, not being a doctor. It was obviously supposed to be McCoy, but they just didn't bother to rewrite it.
How big is your medical staff?
The medical staff doesn't arrive till Tuesday.
Who they detail now? You just become nurses. Let's go.
In fact, Scotty, Chekhov, and even Kirk originally had more screen time, with an opening sequence involving Kirk doing a daredevil skydive being axed at the last minute. In fact, this sequence was present in both the novelization and comic book adaptations, and having read both before I actually saw the movie as a kid, I was kind of confused why this bit didn't end up in the film.
Turn that damn thing off.
In order to give the film a big screen vibe, the cast was kicked up a notch. Whoopi Goldberg, who had shocked the industry by signing on to do the show, around the same time she won an Oscar for Ghost due to her love of Star Trek, returned as Guinan, with a much bigger role than usual.
This is the Nexus.
For you, this is what you wanted.
Malcolm McDowell, a cult icon himself from A Clockwork Orange and Blue Thunder, plus Time After Time and many other movies, secured himself a comeback role starring as the movie's bad guy, Soren.
Actually, I am familiar with history, Captain. And if I'm not too much mistaken, you're dead.
So how does the film fare? It's honestly a mixed bag. Many over the years have said that it feels like a two-part episode, and that's pretty accurate. Paramount was hedging its bets by keeping the film small, although the budget eventually climbed to a still pretty reasonable $35 million, which is about what Star Trek VI cost. But it's also a better movie than some give it credit for. The story is pretty good, with Kirk apparently dying heroically while trying to save the Enterprise B, which was being commanded by the inexperienced Connor Royd. John Harriman, who's played by Alan Ruck.
We don't have a tractor beam.
You left space dock without a tractor beam.
It won't be installed until Tuesday.
The opening has some nice moments, with Sulu's daughter at the helm. This was actually supposed to be Sulu himself, by the way, but George Takei didn't want his character to get demoted, as he had been a captain in Star Trek VI.
Sulu, when did he find time for a family?
Well, like you always say, if something's important, you make the time. Ah, so that's why you seem so restless.
The villain, Soren, is very sympathetic to some extent, with him bent on recreating an energy ribbon called the Nexus, which transports people to an idyllic paradise where their dreams come true. He wants to enter the Nexus so he can be reunited with his family who died, although he's willing to kill millions to achieve this.
You've come to dissuade me from my horrific plan. Good luck. Now, if you'll excuse me, Captain, I'm rather busy.
This, of course, puts him on a collision course with Picard, who himself is reeling from a personal tragedy. You see, his brother and nephew, who we were introduced to in the great Star Trek Next Generation episode Family, have been killed in a tragic fire. This is pretty bittersweet given how the brothers reconnected in that famous episode. He ends up being sucked into the Nexus after failing to stop Soren, only to discover that a version of Guinan actually lives in the Nexus, who helps him discover that Captain Kirk actually didn't die in the Enterprise B, but was sucked into the Nexus himself and could possibly help him stop Soren.
You say history considers me dead. Who am I to argue with history?
You're a Starfleet officer. You have a duty.
I don't need to be lectured by you. I was out saving the galaxy when your grandfather was in diapers. Besides which, I think the galaxy owes me one.
Well, it takes some convincing because, Kirk's got his horses, and while William Shatner loves horses, he eventually reasons with Kirk, explaining that their ideal shouldn't come at the cost of millions of lives, and Kirk, true to form, helps him stop Soren, dying in the process.
It was fun.
So, why do people not generally like the movie? There are a few reasons. For one, it's definitely paced like a two-part episode, with you having an A story, which is headed by Picard and Kirk, and a B story, which takes place on the Enterprise D and involves the crew tangling with the memorable Klingon villainesses from the show, Lursa and B'Etor. Riker, poor Riker, always got the shaft in these movies, although he did direct a few of them, and his screen time in this is very limited, as is Crusher's and Troy's and Geordi, although at least Geordi gets a cool torture scene. The Enterprise D attack involves the movie's biggest special effect, the separation of the Enterprise's saucer section, leading to a redesign in time for the next big screen Trek movie. A lot of the movie is underbaked, but even in the B story there's some great stuff, with Brent Spiner especially getting a really nice turn as Data, who's been driven half crazy by a new emotion chip that quickly gets out of whack, giving him plenty of opportunity to chew the scenery.
You tiny little life forms. You precious little life forms. Where are you?
One thing worth noting is that the Kirk and Picard matchup is really not one for the ages. The fact is, neither man complements the other well. They have their own style of being captain, and if anything, the movie goes out of its way to serve Kirk, who's the alpha male hero, despite his age. When I was a kid, we watched this movie, we all thought that Kirk was the cool one, and that Picard was, well, to put it mildly, a wimp. At the end, he sacrifices himself to save the day, and Picard comes off as brainy and, yes, again, kinda wimpy. In the next film, First Contact, they would change this, with Picard being turned into an action hero, with Patrick Stewart actually showing off his amazing physique, because the funny thing is, despite everybody thinking that he's really thin and wimpy, Patrick Stewart's always been jacked to the max. Even nowadays, it's still pretty big. In the next movie, First Contact, Picard would, yes, become kind of an action star, taking on the Borg in a much tougher performance that admittedly fared better with folks that saw these movies in theaters.
What we leave behind is not as important as how we've lived. After all, number one, we're only mortal.
Speak for yourself, sir.
In the end, Star Trek Generations, contrary to what some fans may think, was actually a pretty big financial success, grossing $75 million domestically, just about the same as Star Trek VI, and it actually made more money internationally, which convinced Paramount to pump more resources into Star Trek First Contact. One thing that might have hampered the film is that the same people who worked on the show worked on the film.
Oh, shit.
They literally only had days off between the wrap of Star Trek Next Generation and the beginning of Star Trek Generations, so no wonder it felt like an episode. For what it's worth, it's not that bad of a start to the Next Generation's big screen run. But sad to say, with the exception of First Contact, it would wind up actually being a highlight of the Next Generation crew's adventures on the big screen.
I do not understand.
But that's a story for another day.
Go to Farragut. 2 to beam up.
When Star Trek Generations came out in 1994, it did a lot better than anyone expected. In fact, it did just about as well at the box office as Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country did, leading many to believe that the Next Generation crew seemed primed for a long run on the big screen. Up to this point, Paramount's main goal, as far as making Star Trek movies, was this: keep the budgets as low as possible. After all, the series never did all that well internationally, so there was no reason to give them an A budget.
I believe I speak for everyone here, sir, when I say, to hell with our orders.
But that thinking changed, for a while anyway, when Paramount went ahead and greenlit the most ambitious Star Trek movie since the motion picture, Star Trek: First Contact.
So unnecessary.
Of all the enemies that the Next Generation crew faced on the Enterprise D, none were more feared or iconic than the Borg. A hive collective of cyborgs that consisted of assimilated humans. From their first appearance in the episode Q Who, the Borg became a favorite. They were scary, but most of all, they looked really cool. Cyborgs were hot at the moment thanks to RoboCop and the Terminator, and the Borg instantly struck a chord with fans.
I've never seen that kind of technology.
That's because it hasn't been invented yet.
What?
There's more I have to tell you. Come on.
In fact, one might say it was the Borg that defined Star Trek: The Next Generation. As most admit, the third season finale / fourth season premiere, The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2, is when The Next Generation truly came into its own. In this landmark two-part episode, Captain Picard is kidnapped and assimilated into the Borg, becoming Locutus of Borg. The Enterprise crew rescues him, and the Borg machinery is stripped from Picard, but he's mentally scarred by the ordeal, and for the rest of the show's run, he becomes a much more vulnerable hero than the franchise had seen up to that point. Not only did Picard carry with him the trauma of being with the Borg, but he also knew that, as Locutus, he played a role in the Battle of Wolf 359, in which 11,000 people were killed, including the wife of Benjamin Sisko, the protagonist of the Star Trek spin-off Deep Space Nine. Despite their popularity, the Borg weren't often featured on The Next Generation, both for budgetary reasons and due to the fact that the showrunners wanted to keep them scary. With a feature film budget at their disposal, the time was right to bring them back, with the backstory from The Best of Both Worlds essential to what became the most action-packed Star Trek movie of all time.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we're closing. And you do understand we have a strict dress code, so if you boys don't leave right now,
The creative team from Star Trek Generations, including producer Rick Berman and writers Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore, were left intact for Star Trek First Contact, but they all knew they were writing a much bigger film than the last one. In addition to the Borg, Paramount wanted time travel to be worked in, so they decided to tell the story of First Contact, where Zefram Cochrane created the first warp vessel, and leads to humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial life, in this case, the Vulcans.
Live long and prosper.
Tom Hanks, who was a major Star Trek fan, almost played Cochrane, only for James Cromwell, who had just broken out in the film Babe, to win the role.
That'll do, Pig. That'll do.
Paramount opted to give the filmmakers a pretty hefty $45 million budget, which was $10 million more than Generations cost. The hope was to hire a major action director to take on the film, with Ridley Scott and John McTiernan approached, but Patrick Stewart was unimpressed, as no one really seemed to know Star Trek.
You son of a bitch.
This really isn't the time.
Jonathan Frakes, Riker himself, was hired, as he had proven himself as a director on all three current Star Trek series, including The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. And hey, it worked out pretty well for Leonard Nimoy, didn't it?
Let's rock and roll!
6.
Looking at the movie now, what's remarkable about First Contact is how different it was tonally from what the other films had done. Jonathan Frakes gave the franchise a much-needed boost of testosterone, with the film feeling distinctly inspired by James Cameron's Aliens. It's a much more action-packed movie than usual, even earning the franchise its first ever PG-13 rating. This edge was meant to bring in non-Star Trek fans, but I remember distinctly, as a Trek-loving nerd in school, overhearing my bullies say,
"Yeah, Star Trek sucks, but that First Contact movie is kinda cool."
One thing they did was toughen up Patrick Stewart's Picard. On the small screen, a brainy, erudite hero is great, but no one could deny he was blown off the screen by William Shatner in Star Trek Generations.
No! No!
For the sequel, Patrick Stewart showed off his biceps and became an action hero, taking on the Borg because, as in any great action movie, this time it's personal.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther. And I will make them pay for what they've done.
Riker, Troy, and Geordi got the B story, where they have to sober up a drunk Cochrane so he can make his flight, with Picard, Data, and Worf
Assimilate this.
kicking some Borg ass on the Enterprise. Picard even gets use of a Tommy gun at one point.
I think you got him.
The supporting cast is solid, with Alfre Woodard great as Lily Sloan, Cochrane's assistant, who, it turns out, is a war veteran and proves to be an asset to Picard and the crew when she winds up stranded on the vessel, even having a bit of a flirty will they or won't they thing going with Picard.
I envy you. The world you're going to.
I envy you. Taking these first steps into a new frontier.
Cromwell steals scenes as the drunk, self-loathing Cochrane, but it's Alice Krige, who everyone remembers as being one of the greatest Star Trek villains ever.
Don't be frightened.
I'm not frightened.
Her Borg Queen is strangely alluring, despite her slimy H.R. Geiger-inspired look. It's hard not to think the Borg Queen is, well, kinda sexy. She even becomes a quasi-love interest for Data, with him briefly looking like he's been seduced over to the Borg.
And for a time, I was tempted by her offer.
How long a time?
0.68 seconds, sir.
Along with the more action-packed vibe goes the Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack, with him returning to the franchise for the first time since Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. His hard-driving music makes this a lot more cinematic than Generations was, which is helped by the fact that the crew has completely redesigned outfits now that they're stationed aboard the more battle-ready Enterprise E.
Computer, mid-21st century civilian clothing. Number 1, you have the bridge.
The movie hit theaters at the perfect time, syncing up with the 30th anniversary of the franchise. It proved to be the biggest hit in the series since Star Trek: The Voyage Home, grossing $92 million domestically, and even becoming the biggest international hit in the franchise to date, making $146 million internationally. It would prove to be a high watermark for the franchise, with none of the follow-up Next Generation movies faring nearly as well at the box office.
Ignore it! We'll be fine!
It was a short-lived success, but a success nonetheless, and for many of us, it remains a defining entry into the Star Trek canon.
I suspect our future is there waiting for us.
Course laid in, sir.
Make it so.
In 1996, Star Trek First Contact proved to be a sizable hit for Paramount Pictures, with the action-packed addition to the franchise grossing a strong $92 million domestically, and another $54 million abroad. Certainly the franchise was set to continue, but as everyone who knows Star Trek is aware of, there's a perceived curse on all the odd-numbered films in the series, and with this one being number 9, would Insurrection be the movie to finally break the pattern once and for all? Nope, not at all.
I apologize for our intrusion.
So unnecessary.
Star Trek Insurrection is a curious follow-up to Star Trek First Contact. While that movie was praised for being action-packed, for some reason a much lighter tone was adopted for the follow-up, with the reasoning from Paramount being that they wanted another Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home.
Watch where you're going, you dumbass! Well, a double dumbass on you!
They certainly wanted it to make even more money than First Contact had, as the budget had to be increased significantly due to the crew's higher salary demands, which is why Star Trek Insurrection has a $70 million budget compared to First Contact's $45 million, but significantly less in the way of action. Indeed, this is the one Star Trek film that definitely feels a lot more like an episode of The Next Generation, and a mediocre one at that.
I will take this to the Federation Council.
I'm acting on orders from the Federation Council.
The film was written by Michael Pillier, a veteran of the series, and it revolves around the Baku, who are like the 24th century version of the Amish.
We believe that when you create a machine to do the work of a man, you take something away from the man.
But at one time we explored the galaxy just as you do.
Despite being technologically advanced, they've eschewed tech to embrace small communal living, but they're being terrorized by an invading force called the Sona, who are in league with factions of Starfleet who want to relocate the Baku in order to exploit the fact that their planet has rejuvenating qualities that make its inhabitants effectively immortal.
There's an unusual metaphasic radiation coming from the planet's rings. It continuously regenerates our genetic structure. You must have noticed the effects by now.
For the Enterprise, this means that boobs and butts are firmed up, Worf goes through Klingon puberty again, Troy and Riker get really horny, Picard starts wearing a super tight t-shirt, and Geordi gets his vision back.
You know, I've never seen a sunrise. At least, not the way you see them.
While it has a bad reputation, the movie does have some interesting qualities. On the one hand, we get to see Picard go up against Starfleet as he feels his commanders are violating the Prime Directive in attempting to relocate the Baku. Like a lot of Trek, the metaphorical themes in this one are pretty heavy. It digs heavily into the relationship between the Enterprise crew members, particularly the relationship between Jonathan Frakes' Riker and Marina Sirtis' Deanna Troi.
So do I lie down or what?
Well, whatever makes you comfortable, but this isn't one of the usual therapeutic postures.
But it is comfortable.
Why don't you try sitting up?
On the TV show, their on-again, off-again romance was crucial, but it was abandoned in later seasons and definitely not prominent in the first two movies. In this one, when Riker and Deanna get their libidos boosted by the Baku's homeworld, they end up rekindling their relationship, and the chemistry between the two actors, who are such good friends that they did the Blu-ray commentary together, is one of the reasons Insurrection is kind of worth watching.
Here we go.
Oh, I remember this
scene. One of my favorite days in show business. What a great day, Marina. Remember they brought us Diet Cokes?
They did. And we
stayed in the pool for hours.
We stayed in that hot tub for hours. We were like prunes when we got out.
Should we tell them that we were both naked?
We were both naked.
That's right.
Riker even shaves off his beard and mustache. Notably, Brent Spiner hoped to have Data killed off in this installment, Alice Spock, but Patrick Stewart was thoroughly opposed to them knocking off his foil. In early versions of the script, Data made his maker, but when he received the final script in which Data lived, it came with a note from Stewart saying, "Better luck next time." Spiner would eventually get his wish in a fashion with the divisive Star Trek Nemesis.
My operation depends on specifications that do not change. I will never know the experience of growing up or tripping over my own feet.
For Patrick Stewart, who was always concerned about how Insurrection's scale paled in comparison to First Contact, the Picard role would be somewhat undeveloped here. It wasn't supposed to be that way, as he was supposed to have an actual love interest in Donna Murphy's Angie, but the romantic scenes were cut out of the movie at the 11th hour, much to Patrick Stewart's displeasure.
Stay with me. Don't let go of this moment.
He also wanted the final battle to be done on a much grander scale, as his final confrontation with the movie's villain, F. Murray Abraham's Rufao, is way too reminiscent of the low-key battle with Malcolm McDowell's Soren in Generations, although Patrick Stewart, similar to First Contact, does get to show off those ripped biceps again.
You're really going to risk igniting the exhaust? All right. I will!
In the end, Star Trek Insurrection wound up becoming a bit of a mixed bag as far as Trek movies went at the box office. It grossed about $70 million domestically, which wasn't bad but was far less than what First Contact made. The end result was about $5 million less than what Generations did, and that movie only cost about half as much. With worldwide grosses included, the film made about $117 million, which means it most likely lost some money theatrically, though probably the first time this happened for a Trek movie since Star Trek V, although it likely broke even on home video and cable, and it wasn't enough to kill the franchise. No, it would take another pretty bad movie for that to happen, but it paled next to First Contact. Indeed, the studio seemed to be losing faith in the franchise at some point, with test screenings for the film resulting in a lot of cuts, and the movie got a belated premiere at Cinevegas, whereas the last film had received a royal premiere in England. It didn't help that when Insurrection came out, it was the heyday of sites like Ain't It Cool News, and the word was out on the movie being silly and low-key long before it ever hit theaters.
Can anyone remember when we used to be explorers?
Looking back at it now, Insurrection suffers from the fact that the story is an absolute dud. How do you go from fighting the Borg to an alien race, the Sona, who've never been in the Trek universe before, and turn out to essentially be human victims of bad plastic surgery?
Raffo, why don't you let the captain and me...
No!
Sequels should be bigger, not smaller, and the commentary track by Frakes is invaluable as he goes well into some of the reasons why the movie wound up being so low-key, and how the writing was on the wall for this film long before it ever hit theaters, leaving him to simply do his best.
But the story wasn't as strong as First Contact. So all the technique and all the use of and we had wonderful the weather for it. We had beautiful wheat fields that we worked with. A lot of stuff ended up being cut out. But the look of the movie, I thought, was fabulous.
He would be disastrously replaced for the next film by Stuart Baird, a director many say had no feel for the franchise, and it's unfair that he's taken some of the blame for this movie's failings, which includes subpar CGI effects, with ILM not responsible for these as they were on First Contact, likely due to the fact that the movie came out just 6 months before The Phantom Menace.
It's working! It's working!
This was the first Star Trek movie where all the effects were CGI, and at the time, I remember they looked pretty decent, but now they seem archaic, something which Frakes himself noted in the commentary with some consternation.
He wouldn't. Yes, he would.
Even still, the movie benefits from F. Murray Abraham chewing some scenery as the bad guy, another fine Jerry Goldsmith score, and some nice character beats for the cast. One especially nice moment has LeVar Burton's Geordi, whose sight has been restored by the Baku homeworld, opting to throw his lot in with his comrades, even though he knows it'll inevitably cost him his sight, with him telling Picard in a nice moment, "How could I look at another sunset knowing what it cost them?" I also like the Troy Riker romance, and Brent Spiner, despite wanting Data to die, delivers a relaxed performance with his chemistry with Patrick Stewart ramped up on this one.
If our first attempt to capture Data fails, I will terminate him. I should be the one to do it. I'm his captain.
While Star Trek Insurrection is definitely one of the worst Star Trek films, it's not actually the worst. Sadly, that would still be to come in one final big screen voyage for the crew of the Enterprise that would make this movie look like the Wrath of Khan by comparison. But that's a story for another day.
Picard to Enterprise, 7 to beam up. Energize.
Star Trek Insurrection was a pretty disappointing entry for the Next Generation crew, both creatively and at the box office. While it made $117 million worldwide, which was a decent number for 1998, this was still about $30 million less than what Star Trek First Contact had made, and the budget for Insurrection was pretty hefty, thanks mainly to star salaries. The movie cost $70 million, which made it the most expensive Star Trek movie to date. While the studio likely eked out a bit of a profit once it hit home video, the margins were pretty slim. Thus, Paramount, which still hoped the franchise could bounce back in another movie, opted to shake things up for the ambitious Star Trek Nemesis. Yet, all the pricey talent they went after, which was at the sacrifice of some of the Next Generation crew's key creative players, couldn't save the movie from being an all-out disaster that ended the Next Generation crew's adventures on the big screen for good.
That is the regulation, sir. Starfleet Code, Section 12, Paragraph
Mr. Data?
4. Sir?
Shut up.
Yes, sir.
So unnecessary.
Jump back to 1998. Star Trek Insurrection was not a hit, and many assumed that was it for the Next Generation crew. It actually looked for a while like the whole franchise was going to die, with Deep Space Nine ending in 1999 and Star Trek Voyager ending in 2001. Neither show was considered popular enough for the crew to cross over to the big screen, and Paramount, for the next Star Trek show, tried to dial down the whole Trekness of the franchise by making it a prequel series called Star Trek Enterprise that starred Scott Bakula, which, in a bonehead move, had a widely mocked Diane Warren song left over from the movie Patch Adams as its theme song.
I will touch the sky, and they're not gonna hold me down no more. No, they're not gonna change my mind.
It was this mentality that infected Star Trek Nemesis. Some of the ideas were sound, with Paramount hiring screenwriter John Logan, who had written Gladiator, to pen the script, and it would center around Picard meeting a younger clone of himself that was created by the Romulan Empire. Not a bad idea. Some of the other decisions, not so good.
You may go.
Where?
Out of my sight.
While it wasn't being considered a farewell film, it did seem like Paramount was looking for a way to scale down the cast in future installments. The movie opens with Riker and Troy being married, with them departing at the end of the film so that Riker could command the Titan. Brent Spiner also got his long-held wish to have Data killed off in a fashion, with him then finding an android resembling Data called B4 that he manages to download all of his memories into before dying. Bit of a cop-out, right?
I do not understand.
It was the choice of directors that really sunk Nemesis, though. While Jonathan Frakes had become a good director for the studio, they decided to bring in a quote-unquote action director for a fresh look at the material. Rather than hire a A-lister, somebody like a John McTiernan type, they chose Stuart Baird, who was best known as an editor, and a very good editor at that. He had directed Executive Decision, which was a very good movie, and the fugitive sequel, U.S. Marshals, which wasn't bad. But he also had a reputation for being a fix-it editor who could save movies that were in trouble. The legend goes that Stuart Baird managed to whip Paramount's Tomb Raider into shape, and then the directing job on Nemesis was his reward for saving that troubled film, which was a pretty big moneymaker. Whatever the case, Stuart Baird had one huge flaw. He knew nothing about Star Trek.
So I went in as a new boy, and except for a few hiccups where I didn't quite know all the procedures, if you like, on the Star Trek Enterprise deck, we had a good time and they welcomed me in.
And apparently made it a point of not consulting with Jonathan Frakes on set, with the excuse being that, hey, Frakes was finishing his own directorial vehicle for Paramount, the teen film Clock Watchers.
Shall we? Make it so, number one. What? We have Star Trek in Venezuela.
Do it. In the commentary track, Marina Sirtis goes so far as to call Stuart Baird an idiot.
And when you say to him, you know, well, my character wouldn't do that, and he says, I don't care, do it anyway. You know, first of all, you want to punch his lights out, but second of all, he is the director, and you kind of have to do what he says, because he just keeps making you do it over and over again until you do.
While LeVar Burton said he didn't even bother to watch Next Generation episodes and thought Geordi was an alien. Baird got into hot water when the DVD came out, with him admitting on the commentary track that he couldn't even remember the names of some of the actors, which I'm sure went down with a lead balloon on set. Maybe that's why Frakes, in a masterful moment of pique, refused to shave his back for a shirtless love scene with Marina Sirtis, forcing the studio to CGI out his back rug. Of everyone, though, the one who got dealt the unkindest cut was poor old Will Wheaton, who was supposed to make his triumphant return as Wesley Crusher. Well, he's back, sort of. You can see him smiling in the Troy Riker wedding sequence, but he has no dialogue. He was essentially an extra. Ouch.
You looking forward to serving on the Titan?
I am very much. I have the night duty shift in engineering, and we have a double refracting warp core matrix with twin intermix chambers. Would you excuse me for a moment? I'll see you later.
If the movie's remembered for anything now, it's for being one of Tom Hardy's first films. He plays Shinzon, the young clone of Picard, and indeed he looks a lot like young Patrick Stewart here, as this was before he started packing on pounds and pounds of muscle. It did less than nothing for his career, with Hardy admitting that he took the movie failing to heart, diving into booze, drugs, and depression once it came out, and he finally pulled himself together years later when he reinvented himself for the movie Bronson, and the rest is, as they say, history.
I'm glad we're together now. Our destiny's complete.
So how does Star Trek Nemesis hold up? Not well. It was bad in 2002 and it's bad now, with Baird a pretty lame choice to helm a Star Trek film. I understand why he was brought on, as they wanted to make the film harder-edged and more action-packed, which is why there's a weird car chase early in the movie. But the choices here are bizarre, including a weird moment where Shinzon psychically rapes Troy, and the rest of the cast, including Worf, Crusher, and Geordi, have all but nothing to do in the film. At least Riker gets to fight the secondary bad guy, Ron Perlman's Riemann Viceroy. CGI though, very bad here, considering that this came out the same year as The Two Towers, although the saving grace is that Jerry Goldsmith is around to contribute his final motion picture score before passing away.
To absent friends. To family.
In the end, Star Trek Nemesis was a total box office disaster. It only grossed $67 million worldwide, and it came out opposite steep competition that included not only The Two Towers, but also Die Another Day, another potential franchise killer, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Next to those movies, Star Trek seemed old hat, and Patrick Stewart went merrily back to the MCU to continue playing Charles Xavier, a role that finally allowed him to escape some of that old Star Trek typecasting. Indeed, with the franchise later rebooted by J.J. Abrams, it looked like this next generation crew was going to go out with a whimper. Stuart Baird certainly didn't have a lot of success afterwards as a director. For his part, director Stuart Baird never directed another film again, although he went back again to being an excellent editor, with him editing Casino Royale, Edge of Darkness, Salt, Green Lantern, Skyfall, the Tomb Raider reboot, and a bunch of other movies. Perhaps directing a Star Trek movie just wasn't for him. But what about the Next Generation crew? Well, it was definitely the end of their feature film voyage, that's for sure.
Worf? Are you all right?
Romulan ale should be illegal.
It is.
Years later, the Paramount Plus streaming network greenlit Star Trek Picard, and while it was originally supposed to be a solo spin-off series for Patrick Stewart's Picard, after 2 not-so-great seasons in Season 3, they decided to get the original crew back together again, and many have called it the best Star Trek movie you ever could have made, with the final season serving as the perfect send-off to the Next Generation crew.
It wasn't until this moment, reunited with all of you, I realized what I've missed most. The carpet.
But what about the J.J. Abrams reboot? Well, that's a story for another time.
Serving with you has been an honor. The honor was mine, Captain.